Hello, everyone. My name is Ananda Valenzuela. I use any pronouns. A little bit about me. I'm mixed, Latinx and white, obviously with a lot of white presenting privilege. I'm also queer and non-binary. And I live on Coast Salish Snohomish land, also known as Whidbey Island in the state of Washington. I'm joining you today as an independent consultant. I do professional interim executive director work and consulting focused on alternative organizational structures and liberatory leadership, coaching and supporting leaders who are trying to do things differently, more equitably, and in a way that's going to support our collective liberation. I'm here and hopefully to give you all just a taste of thinking differently about organizational structures. This is a bit of a digested version of a 4-hour workshop that I run as a consultant that really is aimed to help organizations figure out what structure best serves us, who we are, what we want to be in the world. So let's jump right in. So, as I said, this is a digest version. We're not going to be able to get into the same level of detail. I really hope, though, that you can still get a lot out of this time we have together. Now, we all know the concept of a hierarchy, right? That's like a very classic organizational structure. We have a particular story in our head about that. I'd love for you to consider, what is your story? When you hear hierarchy, do you have a positive reaction, a negative reaction? What kinds of narratives come up in your head about what a hierarchy is and what its impact is? And of course, the other classic organizational structure is a collective, right? A flat organization where everyone is equal. And I'm wondering, as you think of the concept of a collective, what are the stories in your head? What comes up for you? Is it positive? Is it negative? What are the associations you have with the concept of a collective? Today, I'm really hoping to sort of celebrate the fact that there are many organizational structure options. While we have this sort of sense of a binary hierarchy or collective, right? Top down or flat together, there's actually a wide range of organizational structures. There's a whole spectrum. And really the key thing is considering what structure best fits you. Definitely want to acknowledge that folks have likely experienced harm in certain kinds of organizational structures, and that is real. And structures inherently in and of themselves are simply kind of one variable in this really important mix of variables that make up what an organization is and what makes it impactful or not work so well. So let's talk about that. So while today is all about organizational structures, I actually want to start by really naming the fact that I don't think organizational structure is that important. Yes, it does matter a lot. It really, really helps to know how an organization works, right? If you can understand how decisions are made and how people work together, it really helps people come in and navigate the system well. It really makes things smoother and easier, just like all of us following the rule of driving on the right-hand side of the street, makes traffic flow much more easily than if that were not a rule that we all followed. That being said, containers can really be a hook, pulling people in. Structures can kind of get us really focused on, this is how it's always been, this is what's right for us, and other things are wrong, instead of really opening us up to new possibilities. So really deep respect for Norma Wong, who's a strategist, developed a lot of the leadership content for the Move to End Violence initiative. And I really, really want to center and invite us all into really orienting towards purpose, regrounding in your mission, in your values, your strengths, and coming from that sense of knowing who you are and using that to guide the structure you have, as opposed to having a certain narrative in your head that this structure is the right structure, that structure is the wrong structure. We need to have the right structure, that can really get you kind of caught and stuck in structures that may not really serve your mission or what you're trying to do in the world. And importantly, to underline that not everyone agrees with this, and I really respect that. However, from my perspective, in working with a lot of organizations on structure, I don't believe that there's one right structure, right? Like there's that kind of like white supremacy thinking there of like either or, black and white thinking, like one's good, one's bad, you know, that kind of control mindset of like we have to have rules that set and gut and force us to act a certain way, and that will fix things. So I really, really want to invite you all to consider, like, what would it look like to look at these different structures and ways we can operate, and really kind of weigh the pros and cons based on what your organization needs, as opposed to a certain narrative you may carry about what is good versus bad. Like, I think a lot about sort of one of the concerning trends of like brilliant women of color stepping into executive director leadership at nonprofits. They step in the door and their board says, well, you know, we're trying to be more equitable here. So now we have a shared leadership structure, and now you need to make all your decisions together. And, you know, that raises interesting concerns there, right? Like, shared leadership can be beautiful, but can also not be that great. And if you had this longtime white executive director who is trusted to make decisions all by themselves for years and years, what does it say about your values as an organization if you bring in a woman of color leader and just tell them, like, you don't get to make decisions by yourself. We've decided that that's not the right way to operate, and you need to make decisions collaboratively with potentially a very white board, a lot of white senior leadership who may not reflect the community who's being served. You know, I think it can be really kind of diminutive to just focus on one thing, structure, without considering the many other variables that impact the direction you should go and how decisions should be made. So unfortunately, in our social context, hierarchy has caused a lot of harm. It's particularly easy to abuse power. We have one person or a few people that hold so much power in the system. And yet there are healthy hierarchies. There are beautiful organizations where people kind of give consent to let go of power, consent to have other people hold that responsibility. So all that to say, really want to underline that, you know, any organizational structure can cause harm, and, you know, these different organizational structures can be beautiful, abundant, and nourishing in different contexts. And that's kind of the lens that I want to invite you into as we consider these different paradigms that you may want to explore. The other thing I've noticed is that when folks kind of jump into these structure conversations and I ask why do you want to change your structure? There tends to be some common stories around frustration with, like, I don't know who makes these decisions. I don't know how decisions are made. Like, I'm frustrated because it just seems like this one person does everything, or like this person who holds the decision-making power, they are abusing that power, and I have no power in the system to hold them accountable. So we need a new structure where I can hold them accountable. You know, there's all these different ways in which there's these crucial other components of how we work together that can be broken. And sometimes we need to fix that, as opposed to just wholesale changing the structure, right? Like, consider in your organization, if you didn't change anything about structure, but you did sit down and document exactly who decides what, you know, what your role is versus my role, if you had better systems of accountability and effective, like, professional development evaluation systems, if you had better training and supports, right? Like, we can cause harm when we're sort of one person in a system making decisions or not, and just off on our own, and we don't get the training we need to learn how to do our job well, and then it has this sort of ripple effects, and that's the system, right? Letting that person down because the system isn't supporting that person to learn and grow to be able to do their job well. So really consider, are any of these variables negatively impacting your organization? If so, how do you tend to those? Because, you know, those aspects will still be broken in a different organizational structure if you don't really tend to them. That's super important. So stepping back, you know, when I do this as a 4-hour workshop, I really have asked folks to follow a process that looks like this, right? So the purpose overall is to gain a shared understanding of the structures that best fit your organization, and to do so in a way that really kind of gives folks individual autonomy. So there's a worksheet I have folks fill out while they work through this session that really has them self-reflecting on what they want from their organization. And in an ideal world, a year from now, what would their organization look like, feel like, And what would that experience be like that would make them most happy to be in that organization? So let's jump into some of those topics, right? As you'll notice, I don't actually talk in this process. I end by talking about structure options. I start with other topics that to me feel really, really important and feel foundational, and like things that you need to jump into before you try to talk about structure. And the first one of those is culture. Now, personally, I really love working in organizations where there's a strong learning culture, right? Or there's a culture where we all believe that we are constant learners, that we are learning and growing, and that we flourish, and will be more successful kind of in a community if we're able to give each other feedback and help each other grow and work through things. And I'm very aware that a learning culture like this takes a lot of investment. It requires you to do a much higher amount of emotional labor than you do in an organization that does not have a learning culture. So part of this process is about inviting folks in to reflect on, for me personally, do I want to be in an organization where we talk about our feelings? That's a really great example, because I think that especially in communities of color where you may have experienced a lot of trauma or harm or be carrying intergenerational trauma, it's hard. It's a lot to ask you to talk about your feelings and the impact something had on you, and because that may bring up all kinds of other stuff. And that's a lot of emotional labor. There's a lot of weight to that, a lot of effort that should be honored, right? And that we should be in choice about. I really respect that not everyone wants to have to talk about their feelings in the workplace, right? And yet, if you think about like conflict resolution, restorative justice spaces like healing circles, a key piece of these spaces where we try to resolve conflict directly with someone that we're in tension with, they do require us to talk about our feelings and be really vulnerable. Like that vulnerability is part of what builds that trust and supports that healing. But that starts with the willingness to talk about those feelings and be open about them. So I really invite folks in to sit with a whole series of questions around organizational culture and think about, in this particular organization, given our mission, given what we're trying to do in the world, do I want to invest in it in this particular way? Do I want it to be invested in a different kind of way? And how do we respect choice and consent in that? And really respecting that for some people, they will love kind of this deep learning feedback culture, and other folks don't want that. And there should be organizations that fit them too. We shouldn't have a one size fits all approach to organizational types. So start with culture. Culture is key. Culture impacts everything in your organization. And watch out, because often we try to fix cultural problems with structural solutions. And believe me, you can move to a totally new structure. And if you still have the same people stuck in the same behaviors and habits and ways of working together, it's not really going to change. So really consider what you're trying to solve for here. Then the next area that I really go into is a series of definition creation and conversation about kind of more technical pieces, right? Like I talk about shared leadership and distributed leadership, what it means to make shared decisions, what important decisions are, and kind of all of these things really kind of come into how do you want to make decisions? Because of, we tend to just jam a lot of stuff into this concept of org structure, but I find it really helpful to actually step back and to name that the key thing we're looking at here is the organizational structure tells us how decisions get made, what kinds of positional power people have, and how that power is held and impacts decision making. So really consider what are those key decisions that you are planning on making and how do you want to make them. And within that, like this, so this slide is really speaking to a key thing that I love helping people step out of is there's this kind of binary thinking around decision making, right? Either you walk one path, which is one person makes a decision, right? Normally at the top of a hierarchy, they get to do whatever they want. They can listen to you or not listen to you, ask you for feedback or not, doesn't really matter. Like they have the power to decide and you just need to do what they say, right? And sometimes that's great because you're like, that decision maker, it's your problem. That's your emotional labor, your personal responsibility. You have to deal with the impacts of your decision. It's not my problem, right? So that's a classic, one person making a decision. And then the other classic way we think about decision making is a group, right? A group comes together and makes a decision together as a group. Maybe that's voting, maybe that's consensus. There's a lot of different ways for groups to make decisions. But that tends to be the crossing point that we have when we think about decision making, is either one person makes it on their own or a group of people make it together as a group. And I really offer and invite folks to consider a third path. There's this kind of third way. It's not one or the other. It brings in it refocuses us. Instead of focusing on who makes the decision, an individual or a group, it makes us think about how are we going to make the decision? Do we have a shared set of expectations for how we always make decisions? That's called the advice process. Google it, there's a fair amount out there. So just to summarize it really briefly, the advice process says that one person is a holder of a decision, right? So they are the decision maker or the facilitator of a decision. And that's really clear, through role mapping, other ways of documenting who that is, the person who makes the decision. However, before that one person makes the decision or facilitates a group to make the decision, they have to do two things. First, they have to consult with everyone who will be seriously impacted by that decision, right? So already that's a shift. There's a requirement to ask people their insights and feedback on a decision before it's made, instead of just announcing it, being like, deal with it, right? And then second, they need to ask for advice from folks who will help them make a better decision. So that could be your supervisor, your team, folks out in the field who've done similar things. That second one really invites you to get out of your own head, right? And seek expertise from others, seek differing points of views that will help you make a better decision. And then that person makes a decision. Importantly, the how is not set in stone here, right? So that one person could be like, this is a really important decision. It shouldn't be a decision I make on my own as an individual. I need to use a group process. And so that individual could say at the outset, okay, everyone, I'm going to be making this decision by a group consensus process. And then that person would just facilitate the whole process, make sure that we get feedback from everyone impacted, people that will help, and support whatever group is making that consensus decision. That person needs to help them make the decision, help facilitate that process, make sure that the group actually comes to a consensus decision. Or it could be for a different kind of decision. That person's like, this is a pretty important decision, and my colleagues and I, we trust that I'm the best person to make the decision. So I'm going to follow the advice process. I'm going to get feedback from all these people, and then I'm going to make the decision. And folks will trust in that because I will have followed this process that really, really listens to their voices. So all that to say, that's the advice process. It's a third way. Again, it's not inherently better than individual or group decision making, but it helps get us out of that binary thinking, right? It helps us think about third ways, other ways that we can norm around in our organizations around decision making. That was a lot of staring at a PowerPoint. I will note the other realm that I tend to work through in a workshop is helping people self-reflect on their own kind of role they want. Do they want it to be more static? Do they want it to be more organic? Which also helps speak to their level of comfort with change, and whether constant change and transition is something that will feel energizing or exhausting. And that helps kind of give you all insights into the structures that will best serve the group of people that you want to keep at your organization. You want to support them flourishing. So of course, that was a lot of talking about things that was not necessarily structure, right? And that's purposeful. What I find really helpful about this process is by having folks sort of sit with these series of questions and really deeply self-reflect, like that process allows for individual autonomy and consent, right? So for individuals to each sit with, like, what do I actually want in this particular organization, given our mission, given what we're trying to do in community, what ways of holding power, engaging in decisions, thinking about leadership, thinking about my own role, and really importantly, what kind of culture will I thrive in? All of those pieces come together to help give us a sense of what structure will best fit. So I will just really briefly say, like, there are 6 kind of organizational structure paradigms that I found particularly useful and that I purposely end with as opposed to begin with, and help people understand that based on how they answer these questions around culture and decision making and so on, that points them towards certain structures they'll thrive in and other ones that they won't be so happy to be part of. So I'm not going to go into those structures in extreme detail given our limited time, but I do want to just briefly talk through these 6 paradigms to help give you a lens into that kind of, right, just opening up. That's what we're trying to do here, is really open up our thinking about possibilities and also help close things, right? So let's look at these 6 structure paradigms. So these structures are really about how formal decision making is held, right? So you've got the first, you've got a classic hierarchy, most important decisions are made at the top of the pyramid. Second structure paradigm is a unionized workplace, where workers have more power, who get to really kind of bargain for and push for key decision making around how workers are experience the workplace. And there's a strict line, right, between the hierarchy that exists with management and the rest of the workers, who are kind of a separate entity from the management. The third paradigm is self-management, where decision-making power is distributed across the organization. So this is kind of an interesting mix where there are natural hierarchies, there are small hierarchies within the whole organization. Individuals are trusted to make specific decisions on their own in their particular realm. And there is a sense of the group as a whole is holding their own power over mission and direction. The next paradigm is a worker co-op, right? So major decisions are made via a group, right? So all the key big decisions about the future of the organization, priorities, or budget, things like that, they get made by a group. It could be consensus, it could be voting, there's a lot of different ways to make those group decisions. But then for the less important decisions, there are still some kind of classic individual decision making. This individual makes decisions about the communication strategy for their program and so on and so forth within that larger whole. The next structure is a circle structure. And this is a structure where group decision making is the norm for all kinds of decisions, right? So big important decisions are made by the full group. Smaller decisions are made by smaller groups within the whole, right? So you can see how there's a sort of spectrum of going from individual decision-making the default versus just group decision-making the default. And then the last example is the flat collective, where all important decisions are made as a group, and often consensus is used for decision-making. Hopefully, having this sort of mental model of these structures will help you in considering what structures might serve you well. I will note, just to underline, I really don't, I hope that this doesn't end up sort of getting your organization just caught in structure conversations. It's very easy to spend a long time obsessing over structure and decision-making power and how that's going to work in your organization. And part of the reason why I developed this 4-hour workshop, because I really think that we would benefit if we kind of just really concisely explored this question of org structure and just made a decision and moved on. All these structures can be great or terrible. It's going to be much more important who the people are there, how the culture is built, what you're doing on community. And the structure is just one piece of that. So the sooner you can just shake things out and get super clear, this will be our structure, great, we can move on from that. So at the end of this 4-hour workshop, normally what we do is we do a temperature check and kind of do that classic dot voting on a wall to see which structures do people really want, what people really flourish on. And that's a very fast way to get a sense of directionality, right? Is everyone aligned in wanting the same structure, or is there big divides in what structures people want? And is that actually the source of some of the underlying tensions in your organization? So that temperature check then helps forge a path forward. And the hope is that very soon after that, you can make a really clear decision as a group. What structure do you want? And just decide and go with it for a few years, be playful. We don't need to take it too seriously. Have fun trying out the structure that feels like it would really benefit the particular people that are involved in your organization. I talked fast. I talked a lot. Hopefully that was helpful. Definitely feel free to reach out to me if you'd find this useful, and if you have any questions or ways I can support you. And wish you the best on your journey. Take care.